All right, so let's take a look at a news story we have here about the indictment. This is out of the New York Daily News. Here we go. Let's see. We don't need this, and I'll zoom that in a bit so it's easier for all of us to read. A Manhattan grand jury has voted to indict Daniel Penny for the chokehold killing of Jordan Neely aboard an F train, law enforcement sources told the Daily News on Wednesday. The former Marine was indicted on one count of second-degree manslaughter, that's reckless manslaughter under New York law, and one count of criminally negligent homicide for Neely's May 1st killing, a law enforcement source told the news. The grand jury began hearing the case 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks? 2 weeks of testimony to the grand jury on this case? Or they were given 2 weeks to think about it? Maybe 1 day of presentation of evidence by the prosecution. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office declined to comment. The charges will remain under seal until Penny appears in court to enter his plea. Well, I guess they're not under seal anymore, are they? Thanks to a law enforcement source. Penny's lawyers indicated they would fight to prove his innocence. Interestingly, normally in a self-defense case, a defense of others case, if someone's charged, again, with an intentional killing, a murder, and they raise the legal defense of self-defense, the defense doesn't have to prove anything. The state has to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. But so this sentence would make no sense. The lawyers indicated they would fight to prove Penny's innocence. If this were a normal self-defense case, an affirmative defense self-defense case against the charge of an intentional killing, they don't have to prove anything. They certainly don't have to prove their client's innocence. The state has to prove the defendant guilty of the crime, which isn't hard in a typical self-defense case, because the legal defense of self-defense is a legal defense of confession and avoidance. So you're confessing to the underlying conduct. You're not saying it wasn't me. I didn't shoot that guy. You're saying it was me. I shot him, but I did it in self-defense. You confess to the underlying conduct. You seek to avoid legal liability based on the justification of self-defense, confession and avoidance. That's to an intentional killing charge, like murder. And when you do that, the state has to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. But Penny here is not charged with murder. So self-defense won't be raised as an affirmative defense that the state has to disprove. Instead, Penny's been charged with unintentional killing, reckless manslaughter, and negligent killing, criminally negligent homicide. Those are not intentional killings. And so if you're not doing the confession and you're not confessing, I killed him on purpose, but I should avoid liability. You're saying, I never intended that guy to die. And the state's saying, well, you should have known he was going to die because your conduct was reckless or your conduct was criminally negligent. And when that's the criminal charge, an unintentional killing, the legal defense of self-defense is not an affirmative defense that the state has to disprove beyond a reasonable doubt. The way it works instead is, of course, in reckless manslaughter, one of the elements of reckless manslaughter, one of the elements of the crime is recklessness. What is recklessness? Recklessness is when you know you're creating an unjustified risk of death to a person and you intentionally ignore that risk and death results. So a classic example would be drunk driving. You get drunk at a bar, you get behind the wheel of your car, you're driving home drunk. You're not trying to run anybody over, quite the opposite. You're just trying to get home. But you know that drunk driving creates an unjustified risk of death to other people. And then you unintentionally run someone over and kill them. So you knew you were creating an unjustified risk of death to others. You deliberately ignored that risk, and a death resulted. That would be a reckless manslaughter. So one of the elements of the crime, reckless manslaughter, is, of course, that reckless conduct. The way self-defense as a legal defense works in that context is not as an affirmative defense the state has to disprove beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, what you're essentially arguing is that, well, the state claims my conduct was reckless, but I claim my conduct was self-defense. And if my conduct qualifies as self-defense, it cannot have been reckless because one of the required elements to qualify as self-defense is reasonableness, that my use of defensive force was reasonable under the circumstances. And so if you believe it was self-defense, if you believe I've met the conditions for self-defense, then you're also believing my conduct was reasonable, and reasonable conduct cannot be reckless. Recklessness requires that the conduct was unreasonable, an unjustified risk of causing death to another person. So you're not raising an affirmative defense the state has to disprove. You're negating one of the elements of the criminal charge. Now, remember, for an intentional killing, you're conceding to the elements of the criminal charge. You're saying, yes, I did all that. I shot that person. So you're not denying the elements of the criminal charge, but you're saying despite all the elements being proven beyond a reasonable doubt, I still should not be held guilty because I did it in justified self-defense. I have the escape hatch of legal justification. In the context of reckless manslaughter, that's not what's happening. What's happening is the defense is saying the state has failed to prove one of the elements of the criminal charge. They failed to prove recklessness because my conduct fits the definition of self-defense, and self-defense is inherently not reckless conduct. And then the jury has to decide whether or not the state failed to prove that element of reckless beyond a reasonable doubt. And the same framework works in the context of criminally negligent homicide. Now, criminally negligent homicide is different than a reckless killing. A reckless killing is when you knowingly create an unjustified risk of death and you deliberately ignore that risk and death results. Negligence is different. Negligence is when you didn't know. You actually were not thinking about the risk you were creating, but you should have known you were creating a risk. A reasonable person would have known you were creating the risk, and then the harm results. Now, negligence is normally a civil liability concept. It's not enough to rise to criminal liability. Normally, negligence, you just get sued in civil court. Maybe there's a monetary judgment, but you're not going to jail. Criminal negligence is when an act of negligence occurs in the context of conduct that's inherently dangerous. So this could be in the handling of a gun or explosives or dangerous chemicals, where you might not have known you were creating a risk, but a reasonable person knows that guns, explosives, chemicals are dangerous things, and a reasonable person would have known they were creating the risk. That escalates because of the inherent dangerous nature of the conduct, escalates what would have been just civil negligence to criminal negligence and creates criminal liability. So here, what the state is arguing on the facts of the Daniel Penny case, when they argue reckless manslaughter, they're arguing Daniel Penny knew when he put Jordan Neely into the chokehold, he knew he was creating an unjustified risk of Neely's death. He ignored that risk. He did it anyway. He didn't intend to kill Neely, but he knew he was creating that unjustified risk of death. He ignored the risk. Death resulted. Reckless manslaughter. And with respect to criminally negligent homicide, the state is arguing that when Daniel Penny put Jordan Neely in that chokehold, maybe he didn't actually know he was creating an unjustified risk of death, but a reasonable person should have known. And putting someone in a chokehold is inherently dangerous activity. That escalates the conduct to criminal negligence. Death resulted, criminal negligent homicide. And the defense response to both those charges will be, well, it can't have been reckless if it was lawful self-defense, because self-defense is inherently reasonable, not reckless. And it can't have been criminally negligent or even negligent if it was unlawful self-defense, because self-defense is inherently reasonable, not negligent, much less criminally negligent. So those are the legal arguments around the criminal charges here. And the different way that the self-defense argument works with respect to unintentional killings as opposed to murder in intentional killing. For those interested in the legalese, we refer to raising self-defense to an intentional killing as an affirmative defense that the state has to disprove beyond a reasonable doubt. When we're talking about an unintentional killing like reckless manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide, and we raise the legal defense of self-defense, it's no longer an affirmative defense. We don't call it that. We call it something else. We call it a traverse defense that neutralizes an element of the underlying criminal charge. Traverse, Traverse, for the law nerds out there. You don't see that a lot in the legal literature. It doesn't come up a lot. If you Google it, you may have trouble finding information on it, but that's how it works.